Hi, this is Sean Kennedy. I'm the editor-in-chief of the American Journal of Nursing, and you're listening to a podcast in our Behind the Article series, which are interviews with authors of current AJN articles. We also have a podcast series called Conversations, in which we speak with nurses and others on hot topics in nursing and healthcare, and a reflection series, which are readings of our narrative columns on personal experiences in nursing or with healthcare. You can find all of our podcasts on our website, ajnonline.com, under the Multimedia tab, as well as on iTunes and Google as AJN American Journal of Nursing. With a mission to provide nurses with accurate, evidence-based content wherever they look for information, our content is accessible in print, online, on our website, or the institutional Ovid database, and all of our social media channels as well. They're all accurate, information has been vetted, and it's evidence-based. So you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram. So today, I'm very pleased to be speaking with Edie Brow. Edie is a nurse attorney in private practice, where she concentrates on professional licensure representation, medical malpractice defense, and nursing advocacy. She is admitted to practice before the bars of the state courts of New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, the Southern and Eastern Districts of New York federal courts, and the United States Supreme Court. She's a past president of the American Association of Nurse Attorneys. And in addition to a law degree, she holds master's degrees in public health and in critical care nursing from Columbia University. And I'm very proud to say that Edie is AJN's contributing editor on legal issues. So today we'll be discussing her article in the July issue, which is explaining crisis standards of care. So Edie, thank you very much for taking time to chat with me today about the article.
Sure, thanks for the invitation.
It's always great to chat with you. You have such great stories. And of course, you're a fount of knowledge and wisdom that nurses need to make sure that they're practicing the way they should be and staying out of trouble. So very happy to be chatting with you. So in the article on crisis standards of care, you do note that the American Academy of Medical Colleges talks about 3 different standards of care: conventional standards, which are everyday normal care; contingency standards, which is when adjustments need to be made, but individual care remains essentially equivalent; and then the crisis standards of care, when circumstances require major adjustments in care delivery. You also note that this criteria from the Institute of Medicine, and I'm wondering, are these essentially the same, or are there others in which, that have different ones, and whose takes precedent?
Well, the standards of care that are identified by the American Academy of Medical Colleges are the definitions of what can be done during certain circumstances. The IOM, Institute of Medicine, now the National Academies of Science, recommendations are for what the organization should have in place with regard to crisis standard plans. So you don't really need to have plans in place for conventional standards. You already have your protocols and policies and procedures for that. You should also have that in place for contingency plans. But when it's a crisis standard, we're talking about prolonged shortages of resources. And so priorities have to be shifted. And we don't like to use the words rationing, but that's actually what you have to do in those circumstances. So what the IOM is saying is that the crisis standards of care plans that need to be in place have to have certain elements in them. So the biggest one is fairness and equity, so that we are not making decisions on the basis of someone's perceived worth, but rather on their perceived survivability. It's like a form of triage. So they recommend that there's fairness, equity, transparency, consistency, proportionality, accountability, that you have community and provider engagement, education and communication, and of course the rule of law.
Right. So that's a lot for consideration in terms of when one moves to that crisis standard.
Yes, when you have to make determinations about allocation of equipment and personnel, we're talking again about where you have prolonged scarcity of resources. And for instance, the COVID is a great example with PPE and with vaccines and with testing abilities. And with your ability to admit only so many people to a critical care unit, staffing shortages, which has been a problem as a baseline anyway.
Mhm.
But what it requires is that you take more of a utilitarian framework in deciding what you're going to do. And that does cause moral distress in people because you have
Sure.
to make difficult decisions. You have
So it's
to,
kind of,
go ahead.
I was going to say, I'm sorry. It's kind of like for the greater good instead of, we talk about patient-centered care and person-centered care and worry about the individual patient. But in crisis standards, we're really looking at more of a group survivability.
It does change the focus from individual patient care to population health. What's in the best interest of the population at large. So that's why it's really important we don't use perceived social worth, and that we have crisis standards of care plans that are in place that address that focusing. We shift the focus from individual patients to population. When you shift the focus from individual patients to population health, and you take this utilitarian approach, then you can intensify some of the disparities that are already in place with minority populations. The systemic racism that's already causing a problem, the disparities with COVID, particularly in our incidence and morbidity and mortality. So in order to provide that health equity, you have to really have a focused attention on those marginalized populations.
Do you think most nurses in acute care settings or in any of the institutional settings are aware of the crisis standards, or do you think most people kind of find it surprising when all of a sudden policies change and standards change?
I think they're somewhat prepared for it in terms of the protections, the legal protections that they're concerned about with regard to being able to abide by what the normal standard of practice would be, that it's simply impossible when you don't have the resources available to do that. And I think they have some information about the extended immunities and some of the changes that can occur. We have a lot of statutes and regulations that are in place that can be relaxed during these types of epidemics, nurses being able to cross state lines, even when you're not in the licensure compact, that kind of thing. I think they have a general familiarity about that. But what I don't think most nurses are prepared for is the moral distress that comes in making that shift, because it's just not in our DNA. It's not how we are educated. It's not how we practice. It's not part of nursing's culture to not be looking at individual patients. We treasure that. We treasure our advocacy of the individual patient. And, giving that up to look more at what's in a utilitarian viewpoint and what's in the best for population health is not an easy transition to make.
Right. And especially when you have long-term relationships with some patients, as many people in the long-term care settings did. And certainly acute care settings, there's very few long-term relationships that go on, but you may have repeated patients or repeat patients, readmissions. But you're absolutely right. And we're hearing, at least I'm hearing from the CNOs and people I talk with, and from some of the research that's finally starting to come out, of nurses in acute care settings. Ohio State just did one with the Critical Care Nurse Association on people's level of stress and burnout, and associating it with moral distress and increased errors, which we sort of know about. But I think you're absolutely right. And the moral distress, I think some people feel it can be alleviated somewhat by looking at what you are able to do, knowing how bad the situation is, and that everyone's in crisis, but focusing on what you are able to do for the person that you're taking care of. But it still doesn't relieve that basic nursing instinct, as you said.
Well, and I think right now we are seeing that in the psychological health of the nursing workforce in terms of anxiety and depression and insomnia and even suicidality, and certainly the number of nurses who've left or are considering leaving the workforce.
Right. Now, in terms of liability, I mean, we know that the crisis of standards exists, but that doesn't mean won't be litigation. We've seen that after Katrina, when people had to make some hard decisions. and in nursing homes during flooding.
Some of the legislation that was put in place is as a result of just those things, the Category 5 hurricanes that hit in 2005. You know, we had standards at the state level, at the federal level, at the city level. None of them were in communication with each other very well. So there was this all patchwork type thing of laws, which made it very difficult for people. And so as a result of what happened after Katrina, there was this committee put together to start looking at some of those things. But there's also a lot of misunderstanding about how immunity works. There are very common misunderstandings that immunity prevents you from being named in a suit, which it does not do. It never has. Immunity doesn't protect you from being named in a lawsuit. It's an affirmative defense that you assert once you have been named. And an affirmative defense is one that the defense has to prove. So in a normal medical malpractice case or negligence case, it's the plaintiff bringing this lawsuit who has the burden to prove that this nurse departed from the standards of practice and that departure is what caused this patient's injury. But an affirmative defense means that we as the defense have to prove it. So we have to prove that the particular immunity we are claiming applies to the specific circumstances in this case, that all the elements of this particular immunity have been met. And only then will the case be dismissed against this person on the basis of immunity. And those immunities are very narrowly construed. A lot of them don't even exist anymore. They certainly don't apply to licensure defense. They only apply to malpractice suits to the extent that they do provide. But they're also those extensions that have been put in place for crisis standards of care. Nurses really need to understand that these are really temporary. They only apply during the emergency. So as soon as an emergency declaration has been lifted or the government has decided that this standard no longer needs to be in place, then those immunity protection extensions no longer exist.
I see. So it's really important that people know when the crisis standards are in place and then are removed, because that really impacts their own personal liability. As you said, not necessarily whether they're going to be sued or not, but in terms of their defense.
Yeah, and one thing that I have to say for the nursing boards, I think they've done a pretty good job during this whole epidemic. If you go to most nursing board websites, they've got up-to-date COVID information, when there's an emergency declaration, when there's been an executive order, when certain lightening up of the statutes will expire, those types of things, so that you can pretty much stay on top of what's going on in your particular state. I think most nursing boards have done a pretty good job with that, but that's what the nurses have to do. They just have to know if this temporary extension on these immunities is still in place or not.
Right. Now, is there a situation, or might there be a situation where an emergency is, as we saw with COVID in New York when it first hit, it was starting to unfold, and hospitals were certainly overwhelmed. There was a lack of PPE there, and the institutions were basically setting their own crisis standards of care and reworking policies, and there hadn't been an official government or state or even a local declaration that we were in a crisis or emergency. Would nurses be covered in that situation?
Well, the organizations in New York should be as well prepared as any to handle these emergency mass casualty situations, because we've had so many of them. So the organization should already have robust disaster plans in place that are addressing all of these issues, like how you empty out your ER so that you can make room for the incoming, and how you allocate certain numbers of critical care beds, and what you do with the scarcity of resources and personnel, that you've got all the stakeholders involved in that planning. That should all be in place in New York specifically, but should really be in place anywhere. There are areas of the country that are consistently getting mass casualty situations. So, you know, you have the tornado zones, you have the hurricane areas, you have the earthquake areas, you have, you know, the big cities always have these issues. So those organizations should have that preparation and planning already in place.
Right, but in this situation, I'm thinking of COVID, where a hospital has a finite number of ventilators. Um, and I remember reading about a rural hospital that only has two ventilators, one in the OR and one down in critical care for standby, and they airlift most of their patients out. So even though they have standards of crisis, standards of care, perhaps, or a disaster plan, this COVID pandemic overwhelmed so many places that they were now doing innovative, sharing ventilators and had Y tubes connecting two people to the same ventilator, et cetera. So in those situations, I mean, it seems that that was such a unique situation and prolonged. It wasn't like it was a hurricane that hit and then in 3 days things were getting settled back. Not back to normal, but certainly getting a bit more settled, and equipment was coming in. Certainly waiting for the mass casualty tents to come from the government setting up in the fields in different cities helped. But meanwhile, hospitals were, that took a long time for that to get settled. So I'm
and also, things like manually bagging patients because your power's out. And so you can't have them on a ventilator, those types of things. And so what nurses have to do is what we do best, which is, we're adaptable, we're flexible. We just use our best judgment in these circumstances and decide what we can do and what we can't do. And there's a lot of normal primary type care that would normally be done that's just not going to happen today, because right now, we're just going by Maslow. We want to keep everybody breathing. And so there are going to be some people that have skin breakdown because they didn't get turned. And some of the other custodial care things that are essential to patient care just cannot happen right now. And I would say that as stressful as that is, if there's any healthcare professional who has got experience in dealing with not being able to be everything you need to be for all your patients, it is certainly nursing. Because even in the good times, we deal with short staffing issues, and I think it's probably the number one stressor for nurses in all settings and throughout our history is the short staffing.
I think you're absolutely right, and it's something that certainly the pandemic has brought out in full, because you can expand your beds and you can add beds and you can put up tents, but if you don't have staff, it doesn't matter if you have enough ventilators. And I think many hospitals have had, and I've talked to many CNOs who said they've been trying to get staff, but there's no budget. So it makes you question the system's priorities when staffing is so lean that, you're down to a skeleton staff so that you can't even handle a minor surge, which is a bad car accident. And that's one of the things that perhaps, hopefully, the pandemic has taught people, that you can't staff to the minimum.
Right. If staffing is inadequate to even meet conventional standards or certainly contingency standards, there's no way that they're going to make crisis standards either. If you can't even do conventional standards because of the lack of adequate staff and equipment, it's a problem. And it is because budgets are too lean. And I agree with you. I think it's largely on the basis of priorities. And part of that is how nursing services are costed out compared to other providers. We don't bill for our services. We're part of room and board. So we're not looked at as revenue generators. We're looked at as costs.
Right. And that was one of the big talking points in the Future of Nursing report that just came out in May. William Sage, who was on the committee and is an attorney and physician, wrote a supplemental appendix E, if any listeners would like to read it, where he really kind of challenges the report in that not focusing on the largest segment of the nursing workforce, which is acute care. And he talks about the need to remodel finance systems so that the physician isn't the only one who's getting paid for services. And it was quite a thoughtful essay or opinion on the fact that, a physician can write a prescription and gets paid for doing that, where nurses who may be doing nursing orders, carrying out physician's orders, giving the medications that are prescribed, and doing all sorts of things don't get paid for what they do. But as you said, it's room and board.
Even for some of the same tasks, if respiratory therapy suctions a patient, they cost out that to their service. But when nurses do it, it's just part of their job. It's the room and board.
Yeah.
For the same procedure.
Yeah, I'm hoping that this will be a pivotal moment for acute care nursing to rethink. Not acute care nursing. I think acute care nursing and CNOs have been struggling to try and figure this out, but it's beyond that. It becomes the finance model and how CMS is the language that's in the law. And as you know, if it's not in the law, it often won't happen.
Mm-hmm, right.
Yeah. So I want to thank you for this discussion. I know we can talk for a while long about the different aspects.
You and I could talk all day.
I know we have to do lunch again when things are things are opening up. So hopefully we can do that soon. But in terms of all the issues that we've raised, what's the key takeaway for nurses who are struggling with trying to get back to normal and understanding how this all affects them and their liability in their practice?
Well, I think number one is self-care. I think nurses need to be very gentle with themselves. Nurses, when it's just part of our culture, when things go wrong, go down one of two paths or sometimes both. One is catastrophizing and just imagining this whole parade of terribles. And the other is the self-flagellation. I should have done this. I should have done that. I should have done the other. And both of those roads come out of trauma. So I think the first thing that nurses should do is just honor the fact that this is trauma, that they're being traumatized, and treat them the way they would treat someone else who's going through this that they care about. And just engage in particularly good self-care during this process. And that can include trauma counseling, not because there's any mental health issues, but because seriously they are being traumatized. It crosses the line from stress into actual trauma. And you know what trauma does to the brain? It actually creates architectural changes in the gray matter. So self-care, adequate sleep, adequate rest, adequate work-life balance, taking pleasure from the things that give you comfort. That's number one, absolutely number one. And then number two, I would say that nurses need to have a sense of power and control. So they should be active participants in the organization's bioethics committees and in the organizational planning for crisis standards of care. It should not be coming from top down telling nurses what we're going to do. It should be coming from the experts up, and the experts are those people who are at the bedside, the people who are trying to be creative and wear garbage bags because they don't have PPE. Those are the experts, and those are the people who should be participating on these committees and in the planning. And that also gives them a sense of having a seat at the table and empowerment, which can help. Those are the first two things. And then the last thing I would say is go to the National Council of State Boards of Nursing's website or the individual state websites for the nursing boards, and just keep up to date with what is happening in terms of executive orders and crisis standards of care. And a lot of the boards have FAQs, which are very helpful as well, and just get that information and then be very supportive of each other going through this. The lateral or horizontal violence that can occur at times in the bullying in the workforce has no place anyway, but particularly now when nurses are having such emotional and psychological distress, this is really a time to rally the troops around each other and be supportive of each other.
That's great information. And what I really like in chatting with you, Edie, especially, is your concern not just for the legal aspects of nursing practice, but the ethical and the human aspects that nurses deal with every day that sometimes create legal issues. But it's your concern for the nurses in practice who are, for the most part, working to the best of their ability to do what they can do for their patients. So thank you for that special insight that you always bring.
Well, thank you.
Well, thank you again, Edie. And I hope people do read the article. They can read it online or in AJN and listen to the podcast as well. We will indicate that there is a podcast with you on it. And as always, you always bring such a great perspective. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.